I stood in Dad's mahogany-paneled office watching him shake hands with my younger brother Marcus, officially announcing that the empire I had spent 12 years building would now be his to lead. The same brother who had spent those 12 years, partying through college, failing at 3 different startups, and showing up to board meetings hungover. 6 hours later, I was sitting across from our biggest competitor, signing a deal that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Tuesday at Chen Industries, the food distribution company that had become my life's work. I arrived at our headquarters in downtown Phoenix at 6:30, just as the desert sun was painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The building itself was a testament to how far we had come since Dad started the company in 1987 with a single delivery truck and a dream of bringing authentic Asian ingredients to restaurants across the Southwest. Now, 37 years later, Chen Industries was a powerhouse. We controlled 60% of the specialty food distribution market in 6 states, employed over 800 people, and had just crossed the $100 million revenue threshold that Dad had always said was impossible for a family like ours. The same threshold I had been obsessing over for the past 3 years, working 18-hour days and sacrificing everything personal to achieve. I settled into my office on the 15th floor, a space I had designed myself when we moved into this building 5 years ago. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, while the interior reflected my philosophy that modern efficiency could coexist with respect for tradition. Clean lines and contemporary furniture balanced with carefully chosen pieces that honored our family's heritage, including a vintage photograph of my grandfather's original restaurant in San Francisco, the one that had inspired Dad's journey into the food industry. My assistant, Rebecca, knocked softly before entering with my usual morning coffee and the day's priority briefings. At 26, she was sharp, organized, and one of the few people who could match my pace during the controlled chaos that defined our daily operations. She had graduated summa cum laude from Arizona State with degrees in business and logistics, and I had hired her straight out of college 2 years ago, recognizing in her the same hunger for excellence that had driven my own career. The Sacramento. Warehouse reports came in overnight, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with her tablet ready. Revenue is up 14% from last quarter, and the new automated sorting system is exceeding efficiency projections by 12%. I smiled, feeling the familiar satisfaction that came with seeing careful planning translate into measurable results. The Sacramento expansion had been my initiative, a calculated risk that required convincing both Dad and the board that investing $3.2 million in a new facility would pay dividends within 18 months. The projections had been conservative, but the reality was exceeding even my most optimistic scenarios. What about the Portland contract negotiations? I asked, pulling up the relevant files on my computer. Portland represented our biggest potential expansion opportunity, a chance to break into the Pacific Northwest market that could add $15 million in annual revenue. Jennifer called this morning. The restaurant group is ready to move forward with our proposal, but they want to meet with senior leadership before signing. They specifically requested a meeting with you and your father. This was the moment I had been building toward for months. The Portland deal would not only expand our geographic footprint, but also establish relationships with restaurant chains that could lead to nationwide distribution opportunities. It was exactly the kind of strategic growth that would position Chen Industries for the next phase of expansion, the phase that would take us from regional success to national prominence. Schedule it for next week, I decided, and prepare the full presentation portfolio. I want them to see not just our current capabilities, but our 5-year expansion timeline. Rebecca made notes on her tablet, then hesitated before speaking. Again, there's one more thing. Your father's assistant called about an hour ago. He wants to see you in his office at 10 this morning. She said it was urgent. I glanced at the clock, noting that I had just over an hour to review the monthly financial reports before the meeting. Dad rarely called urgent meetings unless something significant was happening, either an opportunity that required immediate action or a problem that needed swift resolution. Given our recent success metrics, I assumed it was the former. Perhaps news about the acquisition opportunity we had been quietly exploring in Colorado. The next hour passed quickly as I immersed myself in the numbers that told the story of our company's health. Every metric was positive, some dramatically so. Our profit margins had improved for the 6th consecutive quarter. Customer retention was at an all-time high of 94%, and employee satisfaction surveys showed marked improvement since I had implemented the new benefits package and profit-sharing program. These weren't just statistics to me. They represented the culmination of everything I had worked toward since joining the company full-time 12 years ago. Fresh out of Stanford Business School with an MBA and a burning desire to prove that I could build something meaningful. Every percentage point of growth, every new client relationship, every operational improvement had been carefully orchestrated as part of a larger vision that went far beyond simply maintaining what Dad had built. I had reimagined Chen Industries from a traditional family business into a sophisticated operation that could compete with the largest players in our industry. I had modernized our technology infrastructure, streamlined our supply chain, expanded our product offerings, and developed strategic partnerships that opened doors to markets we never could have accessed through traditional approaches. More importantly, I had done all of this while preserving the values and relationships that had always been the foundation of our success. Our drivers knew me by name. Our warehouse supervisors felt comfortable bringing concerns directly to my office, and our clients trusted that every commitment we made would be honored completely. This balance between growth and integrity had become my signature as a leader, something that set us apart in an industry often characterized by cutthroat competition and razor-thin margins. At 5 minutes before 10, I gathered the financial reports and headed toward Dad's office, located in the corner suite that commanded views of both the city skyline and the mountains beyond. The executive floor maintained a different atmosphere than the rest of the building, more formal and traditional, reflecting Dad's preference for conducting business in settings that conveyed established success rather than startup energy. His assistant, Mrs. Patterson, had been with the company for nearly 20 years and served as both gatekeeper and confidant for Dad's increasingly complex schedule. She looked up from her desk as I approached, her expression more serious than usual. "He's waiting for you," she said simply, gesturing toward the closed door of his office. "And Sarah, he asks that you hold all calls during this meeting." The use of my first name rather than the casual familiarity we usually shared struck me as odd, as did the instruction about calls. Dad typically maintained an open-door policy during business hours, accepting interruptions as part of the natural flow of daily operations. The deliberate creation of privacy suggested that whatever we were about to discuss required complete confidentiality. I knocked once and entered to find Dad standing behind his desk, his back to the door as he gazed out at the cityscape beyond. At 61, he remained an impressive figure, tall and broad-shouldered with silver-streaked black hair and the kind of commanding presence that had enabled him to build relationships with suppliers, clients, and employees across 3 decades of business development. "Dad?" I said, settling into one of the leather chairs that faced his desk. "Rebecca said you wanted to see me about something urgent." He turned slowly, and I immediately noticed something different in his expression. Not the focused intensity that usually characterized our business discussions, but something more complex, almost cautious. He moved to his chair but remained standing, his hands resting on the back as if he needed the physical support. "Sarah?" he began, then paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I've been thinking a lot lately about the future of this company, about what comes next as we enter this new phase of growth." I nodded, assuming he was referring to the expansion opportunities we had been discussing. the strategic partnerships that could take us to the next level of market penetration. The Portland contract is looking very promising. If we can close that deal, it opens up the entire West Coast for similar partnerships. That's exactly what I mean, he said, though his tone didn't match the enthusiasm such news should have generated. We're at a critical juncture, Sarah. The decisions we make in the next year will determine whether Chen Industries becomes a truly national operation or remains a successful regional business. I agree completely. That's why I've been developing the 5-year expansion plan that takes us into 12 new markets and positions us for potential acquisition opportunities with larger distribution networks. Dad finally sat down, but his posture remained tense, formal in a way that was unusual for our typically collaborative discussions. The expansion plan is impressive work. Thorough, well-researched, strategically sound. It's exactly the kind of thinking we need as we move forward. The compliment should have felt satisfying, but something in his delivery suggested it was leading toward a different conclusion than I expected. But? I prompted, sensing the unspoken reservation in his tone. But implementing that plan will require leadership that can navigate challenges I never had to face when I was building this business. The regulatory environment is more complex, the competition is more sophisticated, and the stakes are considerably higher. I leaned forward, my attention fully focused on where this conversation was heading. What kind of challenges are you thinking about specifically? The kind that require someone with extensive operational experience, someone who understands not just the strategic vision, but the day-to-day realities of managing rapid expansion while maintaining the quality and relationships that have always defined us. His words were making sense intellectually, but emotionally, I was beginning to feel a growing unease. Everything he was describing matched exactly the skill set I had been developing and demonstrating for over a decade. Dad, I've been managing those exact challenges for the past 3 years while we've tripled our revenue and expanded into 4 new states. I know, and you've done exceptional work. But the next phase is different, Sarah. It's not just about growth anymore. It's about transformation. The distinction felt arbitrary, almost meaningless. Growth and transformation were interconnected aspects of the same process, something I had learned through both academic study and practical experience. Can you be more specific about what you mean by transformation? Dad stood again, moving to the window that offered a view of our main distribution center 3 blocks away. I could see trucks loading and unloading, the constant flow of activity that represented the operational excellence we had achieved through years of careful refinement and continuous improvement. I've been talking with the board about succession planning, he said without turning around. About ensuring that when I step back from day-to-day operations, the transition is smooth and the leadership is positioned for long-term success. Now we were getting to the heart of the matter. This was the conversation I had been anticipating. For months, the formal acknowledgement that my role would be evolving from heir apparent to actual successor. The timing made sense, given our recent milestone achievements and the expansion opportunities on the horizon. I'm ready for that transition, Dad. I've been preparing for it, and I think the results speak for themselves. The team trusts my leadership. The clients respect my expertise, and the financial performance has never been stronger. He turned back toward me, and for the first time since I had entered his office, I saw something in his expression that made my stomach tighten with apprehension. It wasn't pride or confidence or even paternal affection. It was something closer to regret, or perhaps resignation. Sarah, I need you to understand that succession planning involves more than just individual qualifications. It requires considering what's best for the company as a whole. What leadership structure will position us for sustainable success over the next 20 years? The shift from personal pronouns to corporate language sent a chill through me. This wasn't sounding like a conversation about my upcoming promotion. It was beginning to sound like something else entirely. What kind of leadership structure are you considering? I asked, working to keep my voice steady despite the growing certainty that this conversation was not heading where I had expected. Dad returned to his chair, but instead of meeting my eyes, he focused on a spot somewhere over my shoulder. The board and I have concluded that the next phase of growth requires a different kind of leadership approach. Someone who can bring fresh perspective to the challenges ahead. Fresh perspective? The phrase felt like a euphemism, a corporate buzzword designed to obscure rather than clarify. Dad, what exactly are you trying to tell me? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He finally looked directly at me, and I saw in his expression the confirmation of what I was beginning to fear. Marcus will be taking over as CEO effective the 1st of next month. The announcement will be made to the company on Friday. The words hit me like a physical blow, so unexpected and illogical that for a moment, I wondered if I had misheard. Marcus, my younger brother who had graduated from college 6 years ago with a business degree he had barely earned, who had spent the subsequent years launching and abandoning startup ventures that had cost the family hundreds of thousands of dollars in investments, who showed up to our quarterly board meetings looking hungover and offering opinions based on articles he had skimmed that morning. Marcus? I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange and distant. You're making Marcus the CEO? He brings a different skill set to the position, Sarah. He understands technology in ways that will be crucial for our digital transformation. He has connections in startup communities that could open new opportunities for innovation and partnership. Each justification sounded more absurd than the last. Marcus's technology understanding consisted primarily of social media marketing tactics he had learned from YouTube videos. His startup connections were mostly college friends who had also failed to build sustainable businesses. His innovation experience was limited to rebranding existing products with trendy names and hoping for viral marketing success. Dad, Marcus has never successfully managed anything larger than a 7-person marketing agency that folded after 18 months. How can you possibly think he's qualified to run a $100 million company with 800 employees? Everyone starts somewhere, Sarah. I started with 1 truck and a lot of determination. Marcus has that same entrepreneurial spirit, and he'll grow into the role. The comparison was so fundamentally flawed that I struggled to form a coherent response. Dad had started with 1 truck, but he had also possessed deep knowledge of the food industry, strong relationships with suppliers and customers, and a work ethic that had driven him to personally handle every aspect of the business until it was large enough to require additional help. Marcus possessed none of those qualities. His entrepreneurial spirit consisted mainly of enthusiasm for ideas that other people would implement, and his track record suggested that rather than growing into challenges, he typically abandoned them when the work became difficult or the results disappointing. This doesn't make sense, Dad. You're talking about handing over everything we've built to someone who has never demonstrated the ability to manage complexity or take responsibility for difficult decisions. That's not fair to Marcus, Sarah. He's learned a lot from his experiences, and he's ready to step up to this responsibility. What has he learned? His last venture was a meal kit delivery service that he abandoned after 4 months because he couldn't figure out the logistics. Before that, it was an app for rating food trucks that never attracted more than 300 users. He's never seen a project through to successful completion. Dad's expression hardened, and I recognized the stubborn determination that had served him well in business negotiations but made him nearly impossible to sway once he had made a decision. Your brother has been working with a business coach for the past 6 months, developing his leadership skills and strategic thinking. He's more prepared than you realize. A business coach? The revelation added another layer of surrealism to an already incomprehensible situation. Since when has Marcus been working with a business coach? Since he decided to take his professional development seriously. Since he realized that he wanted to contribute meaningfully to the family. Business. The timeline was suspicious. 6 months ago was exactly when our revenue had crossed the 90 million threshold, making it clear that we would achieve the 100 million milestone before the end of the fiscal year. 6 months ago was when industry publications had started, featuring Chen Industries in articles about emerging distribution powerhouses. 6 months ago was when Marcus had suddenly started showing up to family dinners, asking questions about the business that he had never expressed interest in before. Dad, 6 months of coaching doesn't qualify someone to run a company this size. I have an MBA from Stanford, 12 years of operational experience, and a track record of consistent growth and innovation. How can you possibly think that Marcus is better qualified? This isn't about qualifications on paper, Sarah. It's about leadership qualities that can't be measured in degrees or years of experience. What leadership qualities? Give me specific examples of Marcus demonstrating the kind of judgment and decision-making skills required for this position. Dad was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling to formulate an answer that would support his position. Finally, he said, "Marcus has vision, Sarah. He sees possibilities that others miss. He thinks outside the box in ways that will be crucial for innovation." Vision without execution is just daydreaming, Dad. And Marcus has never executed anything successfully. How is giving him control of our company anything other than an incredibly expensive experiment? Because sometimes you have to take calculated risks to achieve breakthrough results. Because playing it safe might preserve what we have, but it won't take us where we need to go. The irony was breathtaking. For 12 years, I had been the one pushing for calculated risks, advocating for investments and expansions that Dad initially resisted because they seemed too ambitious or too expensive. I had been the one arguing for breakthrough thinking, while he preferred incremental improvements and conservative growth targets. Now, suddenly, he was positioned as the visionary willing to take bold risks, while I was being characterized as someone who would play it safe and preserve the status quo. The narrative reversal was so complete and so disconnected from reality that I began to wonder if there were factors in this decision that he wasn't sharing. Is this really about leadership capabilities, Dad? Or is there something else driving this decision? His expression shifted subtly, a flicker of something that might have been guilt or discomfort. What do you mean? I mean that nothing you've said explains why you would choose someone with Marcus's track record over someone with mine. So I'm wondering if there are considerations beyond qualifications and performance. Sarah, this decision wasn't made lightly. The board spent months evaluating options and considering what would be best for the company's future. The board, that consists of you, Uncle Tom, and Marcus? The board that has never questioned any recommendation you've made? That board? Dad's jaw tightened, and I could see that my directness was making him uncomfortable. The board of Chen Industries was indeed a family-controlled entity that functioned more as a formality than as an independent governance structure. Major decisions were made by Dad, usually in consultation with his brother Tom, who served as our chief financial officer but had always deferred to Dad's judgment on strategic matters. The board takes its responsibilities seriously, Sarah. We've discussed this decision extensively. When? Because I've attended every board meeting for the past 3 years, and I don't recall any discussions about succession planning or leadership evaluation. Another pause, longer this time. Some discussions happen in executive session. Executive session. The phrase was particularly galling because it implied a level of formal governance that had never existed at Chen Industries. We were a family business that had grown large enough to require corporate structures, but the decision-making process remained fundamentally personal and informal. Dad, just tell me honestly, is this about my gender? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that neither of us wanted to address directly. But it was the elephant in the room, the unspoken factor that might explain an otherwise inexplicable decision. Don't be ridiculous, Sarah. This has nothing to do with gender. Then explain it to me. Explain how someone with Marcus's background and track record is better qualified to lead this company than I am. I've explained it. He brings different strengths, different perspectives. What strengths? What perspectives? Give me concrete examples. Dad stood again, and I could see that his patience was wearing thin. He wasn't accustomed to having his decisions challenged so directly, especially not by family members. Sarah, this decision has been made. I understand that you're disappointed, but I need you to accept it and figure out how you can best contribute to the company's success under Marcus's leadership. The dismissal was so casual, so complete, that it took my breath away. 12 years of 18-hour days, 12 years of sacrificing personal relationships and opportunities, 12 years of building systems and relationships and strategies that had transformed Chen Industries from a regional distributor into a market leader. And it was all being swept aside with a request that I figure out how to contribute under Marcus's leadership. What role are you envisioning for me in this new structure? I asked, though I was dreading the answer. You'll remain as Senior Vice President of Operations, reporting to Marcus. Your expertise in logistics and client relationships will be valuable as he develops his strategic vision. Senior Vice President of Operations, reporting to Marcus. The titles felt like insults, a deliberate minimization of everything I had accomplished and contributed. For 3 years, I had been functioning as the de facto CEO while Dad gradually stepped back from daily operations. Now, I was being demoted to middle management, subordinated to someone who would need me to explain basic business concepts before he could make informed decisions. And if I'm not comfortable with that arrangement? Dad's expression hardened completely, and I saw in his face the autocratic business owner who had built Chen Industries through force of will and absolute control. Then you'll need to consider your options, Sarah. This is a family business. But it's still a business. Everyone contributes according to their abilities and accepts their responsibilities accordingly. The implicit threat was clear. Accept the new hierarchy or leave the company entirely. After 12 years of building something I loved, after sacrificing everything personal to achieve professional success, I was being given an ultimatum that amounted to submission or exile. I stood slowly, my mind reeling with the magnitude of what had just occurred. I need some time to process this, Dad. Of course, take whatever time you need. But Sarah? He waited until I met his eyes. I hope you'll choose to stay. The company needs your talents, and I'd hate to see you walk away from everything you've helped build. The manipulation in his final comment was particularly cruel. After spending 30 minutes explaining why Marcus was better qualified to lead the company, he was now suggesting that my departure would be a loss that he hoped to avoid. It was emotional blackmail disguised as paternal concern. I left his office without another word, walking past Mrs. Patterson with what I hoped looked like professional composure despite the emotional chaos churning inside me. The elevator ride back to my floor felt interminable, and when the doors finally opened, I walked directly to my office and closed the door behind me. Rebecca looked up from her desk as I passed, clearly intending to brief me on the morning's developments, but something in my expression must have warned her off. She simply nodded and returned to her work, giving me the space I desperately needed to process what had just happened. I sat in my chair and stared out at the city skyline, trying to make sense of a decision that defied every rational consideration I could imagine. Marcus, as CEO of Chen Industries, was not just a poor choice. It was a potentially catastrophic one that could undo decades of careful growth and relationship building. But more than the business implications, I was struggling with the personal betrayal that this decision represented. Dad had watched me pour my life into this company, had praised my contributions and relied on my judgment, had allowed me to believe that I was being groomed for succession while apparently making entirely different plans. The cruelty wasn't just in the decision itself, but in the timing and manner of its announcement. 3 days before our biggest board meeting of the year, when I would have to sit in a room with Marcus and pretend to support a transition that made no sense. 2 weeks before the Portland contract signing, when I would have to introduce clients, to the new leadership structure and watch their confidence in our company evaporate. My computer chimed with an incoming email, and I glanced at the screen to see a message from Marcus with the subject line, "Looking forward to working together." The exclamation point felt like mockery, and I deleted the message without reading it. Another email appeared almost immediately. This one from our head of sales asking about the rumors that were apparently already circulating through the building. Word traveled fast in a company our size, especially when it involved changes in leadership that would affect everyone's job security and career prospects. I realized that I had perhaps an hour before the speculation became widespread, and I would be fielding questions I wasn't prepared to answer. An hour before I would have to find a way to publicly support a decision that I privately considered disastrous. An hour before my professional life as I had known it would be fundamentally altered in ways I was still struggling to comprehend. The phone on my desk rang, and I saw on the caller ID that it was Jennifer Morrison, our contact for the Portland contract. The irony was perfect. The biggest deal I had ever negotiated, the partnership that would validate everything I had been working toward, and I would now have to introduce her to Marcus as her primary point of contact going forward. I let the call go to voicemail, knowing that whatever Jennifer needed could wait until I had figured out how to navigate this impossible situation. But as I sat in the silence of my office, looking out at the distribution center that I had helped design and the city where I had spent 12 years building something meaningful, one thing became increasingly clear. I was not going to accept a demotion to working under Marcus. I was not going to pretend that this decision made sense or that it was in the company's best interests. And I was definitely not going to spend the next decade watching someone else destroy what I had helped create. For the first time since leaving Dad's office, I felt something other than shock and betrayal. I felt the stirring of a plan, the beginning of an idea that would turn this devastating setback into something else entirely. Something that would prove once and for all exactly what Marcus's leadership was worth, and exactly what I was capable of achieving when I wasn't constrained by family loyalty and corporate hierarchy. The game had changed completely, but it wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The rest of that Tuesday passed in a haze of forced normalcy that felt like performing in a play where everyone else had received different scripts. I attended scheduled meetings, reviewed quarterly reports, and responded to emails with what I hoped passed for professional composure, while internally wrestling with the reality that everything I thought I knew about my future had been obliterated in a single conversation. By 4 o'clock, the rumors had spread throughout the building with the efficiency that only corporate gossip could achieve. Rebecca appeared at my door with an expression that managed to convey both sympathy and curiosity, clearly having heard fragments of information that she was trying to piece together into a coherent narrative. "The Portland people called back," she said, settling into her usual chair with unusual hesitancy. "Jennifer Morrison wants to confirm the timeline for next week's presentation. She specifically asked if there had been any changes in our leadership structure that might affect the partnership discussions." The question revealed how quickly word was traveling beyond our building. Jennifer was plugged into industry networks that thrived on information about personnel changes, especially at companies the size of Chen Industries. A CEO transition at our level would be news worth sharing, particularly when it involved promoting someone with Marcus's limited experience to such a prominent position. "What did you tell her?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Whatever Rebecca had said would establish the narrative that would follow us through the coming weeks of transition. I told her that any announcements about leadership changes would come directly from senior management, and that all existing partnerships and negotiations would continue without interruption. She paused, studying my expression. "Sarah, is it true? Is Marcus really being promoted to CEO?" The directness of her question caught me off guard. Rebecca had worked closely with me for 2 years, had seen firsthand the scope of my responsibilities and the depth of my involvement in every aspect of the company's operations. She knew better than most people exactly what I contributed and how integral my leadership had become to our daily functioning. Dad made that announcement this morning, I confirmed, working to keep my voice neutral despite the anger that had been building throughout the day. Marcus will be taking over as CEO at the beginning of next month. Rebecca's expression shifted. Through several emotions in rapid succession, surprise, confusion, and something that might have been indignation on my behalf. But you've been running most of the company operations for the past 3 years? You developed the expansion strategy, you negotiated the major contracts, you implemented all the efficiency improvements that got us to this revenue level. Her summary of my contributions was gratifying in its accuracy, but also painful in its reminder of how much I was being asked to surrender. Sometimes business decisions are based on factors beyond individual contributions, I said, repeating the corporate speak that Dad had used to justify his choice. What factors? Rebecca asked, her tone indicating that she found the official explanation as inadequate as I did. Marcus doesn't have operational experience with anything close to this scale. He's never managed a team larger than a dozen people, and his startup ventures haven't exactly been success stories. The fact that Rebecca, who had been with the company for only 2 years, could articulate these concerns so clearly highlighted how obvious the problems with Dad's decision really were. This wasn't a matter of subtle leadership preferences or strategic philosophies that required insider knowledge to understand. This was a fundamental mismatch between requirements and qualifications that anyone with basic business sense could recognize. Family businesses operate differently than public corporations, I replied, offering the explanation that Dad would probably give if pressed. Sometimes succession planning involves considerations beyond pure performance metrics. Rebecca nodded, but her expression remained skeptical. Are you staying with the company? Because honestly, if you leave, I think a lot of other people will start looking for new opportunities too. The warehouse supervisors respect you, the sales team trusts your judgment, and most of the department heads consider you their real boss regardless of the organizational chart. This insight was both validating and troubling. If Rebecca's assessment was accurate, then Dad's decision to promote Marcus could trigger a much larger disruption than a simple leadership transition. People who had built their careers around my management style and strategic vision might not be willing to adapt to Marcus's very different approach, especially if they questioned his qualifications as obviously as Rebecca did. I haven't made any decisions about my future yet, I told her honestly. I need some time to process everything and consider my options. Well, for what it's worth, I hope you stay. And I hope you fight for the recognition you deserve. This company wouldn't be where it is today without your leadership, regardless of what title you carry. After Rebecca left, I spent the remainder of the afternoon fielding similar conversations with department heads and key employees who had heard rumors and wanted confirmation or clarification. Each interaction reinforced the same themes that Rebecca had identified: confusion about the decision, concern about the implications for company direction, and loyalty to my leadership that transcended formal authority structures. By 6 o'clock, when the building had largely emptied and I finally had privacy to think clearly, I realized that Dad's announcement had created a crisis that extended far beyond my personal disappointment. He had disrupted the confidence and stability that had enabled our recent success, and he had done so in favor of an unknown quantity whose leadership abilities remained entirely theoretical. I drove home to my apartment in Scottsdale, a sleek contemporary space that I had chosen specifically for its distance from family neighborhoods and its proximity to hiking trails where I could clear my head during stressful periods. The 20-minute commute gave me time to decompress from the corporate environment and transition into whatever version of myself I needed to be for evening activities. Tonight, however, the drive felt different. Instead of the usual satisfaction that came from reviewing the day's accomplishments and planning tomorrow's priorities, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about my relationship with Dad and my place within the family business. Had he always intended for Marcus to eventually take over, regardless of our relative qualifications or contributions? Had my 12 years of building the company been viewed as temporary stewardship rather than career development toward succession? Had I fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my role and the expectations that came with it? These questions were particularly painful because they forced me to confront the possibility that I had been naive about family dynamics and their impact on business decisions. I had assumed that competence and performance would ultimately determine succession, that Dad's frequent praise for my work and his increasing reliance on my judgment indicated preparation for greater responsibility. Instead, it appeared that I had been functioning as a highly qualified interim manager, whose purpose was to maintain operations until the preferred successor was ready to assume control. The preferred successor, who happened to be male, blood-related, and completely unqualified for the position he was inheriting. My apartment felt different too as I entered and set down my briefcase in the foyer. The space that usually represented sanctuary from corporate pressures now felt like a staging area for decisions I wasn't ready to make. The floor-to-ceiling windows that offered stunning views of Camelback Mountain seemed to mock me with their suggestion of limitless possibilities when my professional options had just been severely constrained. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled onto the balcony to watch the sunset paint the desert landscape in brilliant oranges and purples. The beauty was unchanged, but my capacity to appreciate it had been diminished by the day's revelations and their implications for everything I had been working toward. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Mom, and I considered letting it go to voicemail rather than attempting to discuss the day's events. But avoiding the conversation would only delay the inevitable, and I needed to understand how much she knew about Dad's decision and whether she had been consulted about its timing or rationale. "Hi, Mom," I answered, trying to sound more composed than I felt. "Sarah, honey, your father told me about the announcement today. How are you handling it?" The question was loaded with subtext. Mom's tone suggested sympathy, which meant she either disagreed with Dad's decision or at least understood why I might be upset about it. But her phrasing also implied that she had advanced knowledge of the announcement, which raised questions about how long this decision had been in development and who had been included in the planning process. "I'm still processing it," I said, honestly. It came as quite a surprise. "I can imagine. You've worked so hard to build that company, and you've been so dedicated to its success. Your father recognizes that, Sarah. He knows how valuable your contributions have been. Then why is he promoting Marcus instead of me?" The directness of my question seemed to catch Mom off guard, and she was quiet for several moments before responding. "You know your father believes in Marcus's potential. He sees qualities in him that maybe others don't recognize yet." "What qualities?" Because I've been trying all day to understand what Marcus brings to this position that justifies overlooking my track record and experience. Another pause, longer this time. "Sarah, you know that family dynamics can be complicated. Sometimes decisions that seem clear-cut from one perspective look different when you consider all the factors involved." "What factors are you referring to, Mom?" "Well, your father has always felt pressure to ensure that the Chen name continues with the business. There's a tradition aspect that's important to him, especially as he thinks about his legacy and what he's built." There it was, the explanation that Dad had been unwilling to articulate directly. The Chen name continues with the business. Despite my 12 years of building the company's success, despite my MBA from Stanford and my track record of strategic leadership, despite my deep knowledge of every aspect of our operations, I would never be a true Chen in the way that Marcus was. "Mom, I've been a Chen for 12 years. I've dedicated my entire adult life to building this business and supporting this family. How is that less valuable than sharing a Y chromosome with Dad?" "Sweetheart, it's not about value. You know how much your father loves you and respects what you've accomplished. It's about tradition and expectations that have been in place for generations." "What traditions?" Dad started this company 37 years ago with a delivery truck. He didn't inherit it from his father or grandfather. He built it from nothing using exactly the same kind of determination and strategic thinking that I've been demonstrating for over a decade. That's true, but now that it exists, he wants to ensure it continues as a family legacy for Marcus's children and their children. He's thinking about the long term, about maintaining the Chen family connection across generations. The logic was circular and discriminatory, but it explained the inexplicable. Dad wasn't evaluating Marcus and me based on our qualifications for leadership. He was choosing between us based on our potential for producing male heirs who would carry the Chen surname into future generations. So this is about grandchildren who don't exist yet taking over a company that might not survive Marcus's leadership? Sarah, that's not fair. Marcus is smart and motivated, and he'll have excellent support from you and the rest of the management team. Marcus is smart when he applies himself, which is rarely. He's motivated when something interests him, which changes every 6 months. And now I'm supposed to provide excellent support while he learns on the job how to run a $100 million company? I understand why you're upset, honey. But maybe this could be an opportunity for you to explore other options, to think about what you really want from your career. The suggestion that I should view my demotion as an opportunity for career exploration was so patronizing that I struggled to formulate a response. Other options? I had found exactly what I wanted from my career: the chance to build something meaningful, to lead a team toward shared goals, to create value for customers and employees while achieving financial success. Mom, what I really want from my career is the chance to use my abilities and experience to their fullest potential. That's what I've been doing at Chen Industries, and that's what's being taken away from me. I know this is difficult, Sarah, but your father has made his decision, and you'll need to find a way to work within that reality. Work within that reality. The phrase encapsulated everything that was wrong with the situation and everything that was unacceptable about the proposed solution. I was being asked to accept a reality that made no business sense in order to preserve family harmony and support traditions that discriminated against me based on my gender. After ending the call with Mom, I sat on my balcony as darkness settled. Over the desert and city lights began to twinkle in the distance. The conversation had clarified Dad's motivations, but it had also crystallized my own position. I was not going to work within a reality that diminished my contributions and limited my future based on arbitrary gender preferences. For 12 years, I had been building Chen Industries not just as an employee, but as someone who expected to inherit leadership responsibility, commensurate with my contributions. I had sacrificed personal relationships, declined job offers from competitors, and invested my professional identity in the company's success, because I believed that my dedication would be rewarded with the opportunity to guide its future direction. Now I understood that my dedication had been valued only insofar as it supported someone else's eventual succession. I had been building a legacy that would never belong to me, developing capabilities that would never be fully utilized, and preparing for leadership opportunities that had never actually been available. The realization was devastating, but it was also liberating. If my future at Chen Industries was limited to middle management under Marcus's questionable leadership, then perhaps my future lay elsewhere entirely. Perhaps the skills and relationships and strategic insights I had developed could be applied to different challenges, ones where my success would benefit me directly rather than indirectly. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for David Rodriguez, the CEO of Southwest Specialty Foods, our largest competitor. David and I had developed a respectful professional relationship over the years, occasionally encountering each other at industry conferences and trade association meetings. He had made several casual mentions of opportunities at his company, suggestions that I had politely deflected out of loyalty to Chen Industries. But loyalty was a two-way commitment, and it was clear that mine had not been reciprocated. If Dad valued tradition over competence and gender over qualifications, Then perhaps it was time for me to explore environments where different values prevailed. I didn't call David that night, but I made a mental note to reach out to him within the next few days. Not necessarily to discuss employment opportunities, but to better understand the competitive landscape and the strategic challenges facing companies like ours. Knowledge that might prove valuable regardless of which direction my career ultimately took. The next morning, Wednesday, brought a series of meetings that felt surreal in their disconnection from the previous day's announcement. Department heads presented quarterly reports, sales managers discussed client retention strategies, and operations supervisors outlined efficiency improvements, all while carefully avoiding any direct references to the leadership transition that was supposedly taking place in 3 weeks. The elephant in the room was so large and obvious that its absence from conversation created a weird artificial atmosphere where everyone pretended that business was continuing as usual, while privately wondering what changes were coming and how they would be affected. Marcus made an appearance at the 10 o'clock management meeting, arriving 15 minutes late with coffee from the trendy shop across the street rather than the break room coffee that the rest of us were drinking. He settled into the chair at the opposite end of the table from me, opened his laptop, and proceeded to spend most of the meeting checking email and social media, while occasionally nodding along with discussions he clearly wasn't following. When Alexander Chen, our head of logistics, mentioned concerns about capacity constraints in our Phoenix distribution center, Marcus looked up from his screen and offered his first substantive comment of the meeting. Maybe we should look into some kind of AI solution for optimizing warehouse efficiency. I've been reading about machine learning applications that could revolutionize how we handle inventory management. Alexander glanced at me with barely concealed confusion before responding diplomatically. We actually implemented a new inventory management system last year that incorporates predictive analytics for demand forecasting. The capacity constraints Marcus is referring to are physical space limitations rather than software inefficiencies. Marcus nodded as if this clarification made perfect sense, then returned his attention to his laptop without asking any follow-up questions about the actual problem or potential solutions. The interaction perfectly encapsulated his approach to business challenges. Superficial awareness of trendy concepts combined with little understanding of practical implementation or operational realities. After the meeting, several department heads lingered to discuss specific issues that required coordination across different functional areas. Marcus left immediately, mentioning something about a lunch meeting with potential investors for a new venture he was exploring. The irony of our incoming CEO pursuing outside business interests while preparing to assume responsibility for our company was not lost on anyone present. Is he planning to continue his other projects after taking over as CEO? Asked Jennifer. Walsh, our marketing director, once Marcus was safely out of earshot. I haven't seen any indication that he plans to wind down his external activities, I replied honestly. But I assume those details will be clarified as the transition progresses. Jennifer exchanged glances with Alexander and Patricia Simmons, our human resources director. The concern in their expressions was obvious, though they were too professional to voice their reservations about Marcus's apparent lack of focus on Chen Industries' business. Sarah, Patricia said carefully, a lot of people are asking questions about how this transition will affect reporting structures, performance evaluations, strategic planning processes, day-to-day operations. They're looking for reassurance that the systems and relationships they've built will remain stable. The request for reassurance that I couldn't provide was particularly painful. These were people who had worked with me for years, who trusted my judgment and relied on my leadership for guidance during complex situations. Now they were being asked to transfer that trust to someone whose qualifications and commitment remained questionable. I think the best approach is to maintain focus on our current objectives and performance standards while being prepared to adapt as new leadership direction becomes clear, I said, offering the kind of diplomatic non-answer that preserved everyone's professional dignity while acknowledging the uncertainty we all faced. After lunch, Rebecca appeared at my door with an expression that indicated she had news that would complicate an already difficult day. Marcus asked me to schedule a meeting with you for tomorrow afternoon. He wants to discuss transition planning and your role in the new organizational structure. The prospect of sitting across from Marcus while he explained how he envisioned my future at the company I had built was almost more than I could contemplate. But avoiding the conversation would only delay the inevitable and potentially make me appear petulant or unprofessional. "What time?" I asked, resigned to enduring whatever awkward combination of condescension and inexperience Marcus would bring to our discussion. 2:00 in the small conference room. He also asked me to prepare organizational charts and financial summaries for his review beforehand. The request revealed Marcus's awareness that he would need significant briefing material to participate meaningfully in strategic conversations, but it also highlighted his assumption that my assistant would naturally shift her priorities to support his information needs. The casual appropriation of my resources without consultation was a preview of the management style I could expect under his leadership. "Rebecca, I want you to know that whatever changes come with this transition, I value your professionalism and I'll do everything I can to ensure that your position remains secure and your career development continues." She nodded appreciatively, but I could see in her expression the same uncertainty that was affecting everyone else. Promises about job security and career development were only meaningful if I retained sufficient influence to honor them, something that seemed increasingly unlikely under the new regime. That evening, I drove to the restaurant where I was meeting my college roommate Lisa for dinner, a monthly tradition we had maintained despite our increasingly divergent career paths. Lisa had chosen academia over business, earning a PhD in organizational psychology and now serving as a professor at Arizona State University. Her research focused on leadership dynamics and gender bias in corporate environments, topics that had never felt more personally relevant. Lisa was already seated when I arrived, her expression shifting from casual friendliness to concerned attention as she took in my appearance and demeanor. "You look like someone who's had a particularly brutal week," she observed as I settled into the chair across from her. "What's going on?" I gave her a condensed version of the previous day's announcement and the subsequent developments. Watching, her expression evolved from surprise to indignation to analytical interest as she processed the implications of Dad's decision. "So, your father is promoting your less qualified brother to CEO of the company you've essentially been running for 3 years," she summarized when I finished. "And his justification is that Marcus brings fresh perspective and innovative thinking?" Along with some vague references to leadership qualities that can't be measured in degrees or years of experience. Lisa shook her head with the combination of professional expertise and personal outrage that made her such a valuable friend. "Sarah, this is a textbook example of the kind of gender bias that my research documents all the time. The pattern is so predictable it's almost comical, except for the fact that it's destroying careers and limiting organizational effectiveness." "What pattern?" "Women outperform men on virtually every measurable criterion: competence, education, experience, results. But men get promoted based on potential, while women are evaluated on achievement. Your father is literally choosing Marcus because he might develop into an effective leader, while dismissing you despite the fact that you've already demonstrated effective leadership." The academic framing of my situation was both validating and depressing. Validating because it confirmed that Dad's decision was as illogical as it seemed. Depressing because it suggested that similar decisions were common enough to constitute a research-worthy pattern. "The other classic element," Lisa continued, "is the narrative about different strengths and perspectives. It's a way of avoiding direct comparison of qualifications by suggesting that the positions require fundamentally different skill sets, even when that's obviously not true. So what you're saying is that this isn't really about Marcus's potential or my limitations. It's about unconscious bias that makes Dad more comfortable with male leadership." "I'm saying it's about conscious and unconscious bias that makes your father and men like him more willing to take risks on unproven male candidates than to reward proven female performance. The research on this is overwhelming and depressing. Lisa's analysis clarified something that I had been struggling to articulate even to myself. The problem wasn't that I had failed to demonstrate my qualifications for leadership. The problem was that my qualifications would never be sufficient to overcome deeply ingrained assumptions about gender and leadership that Dad himself might not even recognize. So what do I do? Accept a demotion and spend the next decade helping Marcus learn how to run the company I built? Look for opportunities elsewhere and start over at a different organization? Try to fight a decision that's already been made and probably lose? You could do any of those things, Lisa replied thoughtfully. But given your track record and capabilities, you have a fourth option that might be more interesting. What's that? You could compete with them directly. Take everything you've learned about the industry and the market. Use the relationships you've built and the expertise you've developed, and create something better than what they'll be able to achieve under Marcus's leadership. The suggestion was so audacious that I initially dismissed it as academic theorizing disconnected from business realities. Starting a competing company would require enormous capital investment, extensive planning, and the willingness to directly challenge people who had been my family and colleagues for over a decade. But as Lisa elaborated on her thinking, the idea began to seem less impossible and more intriguing. I understood the food distribution industry better than almost anyone. I had relationships with suppliers, customers, and key personnel that had been built over years of professional interaction. I had identified operational inefficiencies and market opportunities that Chen Industries had never fully exploited. Most importantly, I had something that Marcus would never possess: the respect and trust of the people who actually made the business function. The warehouse supervisors, sales managers, logistics coordinators, and account representatives who had worked with me for years and had seen firsthand how my leadership translated into improved performance and job satisfaction. Even if I could convince people to leave Chen Industries and join a startup competitor, which is a huge if, the capital requirements would be enormous. We're talking about warehouse facilities, distribution fleets, inventory investments, technology, systems. It would take millions of dollars just to achieve basic operational capability. True, Lisa acknowledged. But you know investors who understand the industry, and you have a track record that would make a compelling case for funding. More importantly, you wouldn't need to replicate Chen Industries' entire operation immediately. You could start with a focused approach, targeting specific market segments or geographic areas where you could demonstrate superior value. The conversation continued through dinner and into the evening, with Lisa helping me think through possibilities that I had never seriously considered. By the time we parted ways, I hadn't committed to any specific course of action, but I had a much clearer understanding of my options and their potential implications. Driving home through the desert darkness, I reflected on how completely my perspective had shifted in just 48 hours. Monday morning, I had been the heir apparent to a family business that I loved, focused on execution strategies that would take us to the next level of growth and market penetration. Thursday evening, I was contemplating whether to compete directly against that same business, using everything I had learned during my tenure there to build something entirely new. The transformation felt both devastating and exhilarating. Devastating, because it represented the end of relationships and commitments that had defined my adult life. Exhilarating, because it opened possibilities for independence and achievement that had been constrained by family dynamics and corporate hierarchy. As I pulled into my apartment complex and prepared for another sleepless night of processing impossible decisions, one thing had become absolutely clear. I was not going to spend the next phase of my career in a subordinate role, supporting someone else's vision while my own capabilities were systematically underutilized. Whether that meant leaving Chen Industries for a competitor, starting my own company, or finding some other path forward, I was done accepting limitations imposed by other people's assumptions about what I could or should achieve. Marcus might be inheriting the family business, but he was not inheriting me as part of the package. The real question was no longer whether I would leave, but how I would leave and what I would build in place of what I was losing. And for the first time since Dad's announcement, I felt something resembling excitement about the possibilities that lay ahead. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crystal-clear desert sky that usually filled me with optimism about the day ahead. Instead, I found myself sitting in my car in the Chen Industries parking garage at 6:15, staring at the building that had been my professional home for 12 years, and feeling like a stranger preparing to enter hostile territory. The EI meeting with Marcus was scheduled for 2 o'clock, but I had arrived early to complete a project that had been taking shape in my mind since my conversation with Lisa. If I was going to leave Chen Industries, whether for a competitor or to start my own company, I needed to document everything I had built, learned, and contributed during my tenure, not for sentimental reasons, but for strategic ones. I spent the morning creating detailed files that captured operational procedures, client relationship histories, supplier negotiations, strategic planning processes, and performance improvement initiatives that I had developed over the years. Information that existed primarily in my head and in scattered documents across multiple systems. Knowledge that would walk out the door with me when I left. The process was both methodical and emotional. Every spreadsheet and presentation reminded me of challenges overcome, relationships built, and victories achieved through persistence and strategic thinking. Collectively, they represented a comprehensive blueprint for running a food distribution company successfully. Blueprint that had taken 12 years to develop and would be impossible for Marcus to replicate quickly. By noon, I had compiled everything into organized digital files stored on a personal drive that I could access from anywhere. The information wasn't proprietary in any legal sense, but it represented intellectual capital that Chen Industries had never properly systematized or protected. Knowledge that could prove invaluable if I decided to leverage my experience in a different context. Rebecca appeared at my door with lunch from the deli downstairs, a gesture of thoughtfulness that reminded me how much I would miss working with someone who anticipated my needs and supported my priorities without requiring constant direction. "You've been working intensively all morning," she observed, setting the sandwich and salad on my desk. "Are you preparing for your meeting with Marcus?" "Among other things," I replied, accepting the food gratefully. "Rebecca, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She settled into her chair with an expression that indicated she was prepared for a serious conversation. "Of course. If I left Chen Industries, would you consider leaving as, well, not immediately, but perhaps after you had time to evaluate how things develop under the new leadership?" The question clearly surprised her, though she took time to consider it thoughtfully before responding. "Can I ask where you're thinking of going?" "I'm exploring several possibilities. One involves joining a competitor in a senior leadership role. Another involves starting something new, building a company from the ground up using everything I've learned here." Rebecca's eyes widened as she processed the implications of what I was describing. "You're thinking about starting your own food distribution company?" "I'm thinking about a lot of things. But yes, that's one option I'm considering seriously." "Sarah, that would be incredible. And honestly, yes, I would absolutely consider joining you. Working with you has been the best professional experience I've ever had, and I can't imagine that continuing under Marcus's management." The enthusiasm in her response was gratifying, but it also highlighted the responsibility that would come with any decision to leave Chen Industries. If I departed, I wouldn't just be affecting my own career trajectory. I would be influencing the futures of people who had built their professional relationships around my leadership style and strategic vision. "I need you to keep this conversation completely confidential for now," I emphasized. "I haven't made any final decisions, and I don't want to create unnecessary disruption while I'm still evaluating options." "Of course. But Sarah, if you do decide to leave, I hope you'll give me the opportunity to be part of whatever you build next. At 2 o'clock, I walked to the small conference room where Marcus was waiting with a laptop, several printed documents, and an expression that attempted to convey executive authority, but mostly suggested nervousness about the conversation ahead. He had dressed more formally than usual, wearing a suit that I suspected was borrowed from Dad's closet, and his hair was styled in a way that added years to his appearance. "Sarah, thanks for making time for this meeting," he began as I took the seat across from him. "I know this transition is happening quickly, and I want to make sure we're aligned on how to move forward productively." The corporate language felt awkward coming from someone who usually communicated in startup jargon and social media terminology, but I appreciated his attempt to establish a professional tone for our discussion. "I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the organizational structure and strategic direction," I replied diplomatically. Marcus opened his laptop and pulled up what appeared to be a presentation he had been working on. Slides with titles like "Modernizing Operations Through Digital Innovation" and "Leveraging Synergies for Scalable Growth." The buzzword density was impressive, but the content was superficial in ways that revealed his limited understanding of our actual business challenges. "I've been thinking about ways to optimize our competitive positioning through technology integration and data-driven decision-making," he began, reading from his notes rather than speaking conversationally. "I see tremendous opportunities to streamline processes and enhance customer experience through automation and predictive analytics." The presentation continued for 15 minutes, covering topics like artificial intelligence applications, blockchain potential for supply chain transparency, and social media strategies for brand engagement. All concepts that might have relevance for food distribution companies in general, but none addressing specific challenges or opportunities that Chen Industries was actually facing. When he finished, Marcus looked at me expectantly, clearly hoping for validation of his strategic vision. Instead, I found myself struggling to formulate a response that was honest without being dismissive. "Those are interesting concepts," said carefully. "How do you see them addressing our current operational priorities? For example, the capacity constraints in Phoenix that Alexander mentioned yesterday, or the Portland expansion that's scheduled to launch next month." Marcus glanced at his notes, but apparently hadn't prepared for questions about specific operational issues. "Well, I think technology solutions could potentially address capacity challenges more efficiently than traditional expansion approaches, and the Portland launch could benefit from enhanced digital marketing strategies to accelerate customer acquisition." The answers revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of our business model and the nature of the challenges we were facing. Capacity constraints required physical infrastructure investments, not technology solutions. The Portland expansion was based on existing customer relationships and contracted volume commitments, not digital marketing campaigns targeting new prospects. "Marcus, our Portland expansion is built around a signed contract with Morrison Restaurant Group for exclusive distribution of specialty ingredients to their 43 locations across Oregon and Washington. The revenue is guaranteed based on contractual volume commitments. Customer acquisition isn't the challenge. Fulfillment capacity is." "Right, of course," he said, making notes on his laptop. "So the technology applications would focus more on optimizing fulfillment efficiency rather than marketing reach." "What specific technology applications are you thinking about for fulfillment optimization?" Another pause while Marcus consulted his notes. "I'd need to research the available options more thoroughly before making specific recommendations, but I'm confident there are innovative solutions that could address those challenges." The conversation continued in this pattern for another 20 minutes, with Marcus presenting high-level concepts that sounded impressive but lacked practical application to our actual business circumstances. When I asked detailed questions about implementation, costs, timelines, or measurable benefits, he invariably deferred to future research and analysis. Finally, we reached the topic I had been dreading: my role in the new organizational structure. "Sarah, I want you to know how much I value your experience and institutional knowledge, Marcus said, shifting to what I assumed was his prepared speech about my future. Your operational expertise and client relationships are going to be crucial for the company's continued success. I waited for him to continue, curious about how he would frame my demotion in positive terms. I'm thinking about your role as Senior Vice President of Operations as more of a partnership than a traditional reporting relationship. You would continue to handle day-to-day operational management, while I focus on strategic planning and business development. The description was almost comical in its disconnection from organizational reality. Day-to-day operational management was strategic planning, and business development required deep understanding of operational capabilities and constraints. Marcus was essentially proposing that I continue doing the CEO's job while he carried the CEO's title. What specific strategic planning and business development activities are you envisioning for yourself? I asked. Market analysis, competitive positioning, partnership development, investor relations, technology evaluation, those kinds of high-level functions that require someone to think big picture rather than getting bogged down in operational details. The dismissal of operational details as somehow less important than big picture thinking demonstrated Marcus's fundamental misunderstanding of executive leadership. Successful strategy emerged from deep operational knowledge, not from abstract market analysis disconnected from implementation realities. And how do you see the decision-making process working? If operational requirements conflict with strategic initiatives, who has final authority? Marcus considered this question for a moment, perhaps recognizing it as more complex than his prepared talking points had anticipated. I think we would work collaboratively to find solutions that address both operational constraints and strategic objectives. But ultimately, if we can't reach agreement, someone has to make the final decision. That's why companies have organizational hierarchies and clear authority structures. Well, as CEO, I would have final responsibility for major strategic decisions, but I would definitely want your input and recommendations before making those choices. There it was, the fundamental dynamic that would define my role under Marcus's leadership. I would provide the analysis, expertise, and recommendations that informed decisions, but he would retain the authority to accept or reject my advice based on his judgment. My 12 years of experience would be relegated to an advisory function, subordinated to someone whose business knowledge came primarily from online articles and startup conferences. Marcus, I appreciate your confidence in my operational capabilities, but I need to be direct with you about something. The role you're describing isn't sustainable for me professionally. I didn't spend 12 years building this company's success to become a middle manager whose recommendations might or might not be implemented by someone with less experience in this industry. My directness clearly surprised him, and he leaned back in his chair while formulating a response. Sarah, I understand that this transition involves adjustments for everyone. But we're family, and I hope we can find a way to work together that utilizes everyone's strengths effectively. We are family, and that's exactly why I need to be honest with you. This company requires leadership that understands the complexity of our operations, the nuances of our client relationships, and the competitive dynamics of our market. Those capabilities take years to develop, and they can't be supplemented by enthusiasm or good intentions. Marcus's expression shifted from surprise to something approaching defensiveness. Are you saying you don't think I'm qualified for this position? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that would affect our relationship permanently, regardless of how I answered. I could offer diplomatic reassurance that would preserve family harmony while avoiding the truth. Or I could provide honest feedback that might damage our personal relationship, but would serve the company's interests. I'm saying that CEO leadership requires specific experience and proven capabilities that take time to develop. Dad built this company over 37 years by learning every aspect of the business through direct involvement. I've spent 12 years doing the same thing. building expertise through hands-on experience with operations, strategy, and relationship management. And you don't think I can develop those same capabilities? I think you could develop them, given sufficient time and the right developmental opportunities. But stepping directly into the CEO role of a $100 million company isn't the appropriate way to acquire that experience. It's like asking someone to perform surgery based on medical textbooks rather than residency training. The comparison was harsh but accurate, and Marcus's reaction suggested that he understood the validity of my point, even if he didn't appreciate its implications for his promotion. Sarah, Dad has confidence in my potential, and he's willing to provide the support and guidance I need to grow into this role. That has to count for something. Dad's confidence is valuable, but potential doesn't protect the company from bad decisions or operational failures. The employees, clients, and suppliers who depend on Chen Industries for their livelihoods deserve leadership that can handle complex challenges immediately, not someone who's learning on the job while they hope for the best. Marcus closed his laptop and gathered his documents, clearly recognizing that our conversation was not developing in the direction he had anticipated. I think we should probably continue this discussion after we've both had time to process everything. This transition is stressful for everyone, and maybe we're not in the right headspace for productive planning. The suggestion that stress was clouding my judgment rather than clarifying it was the final indication I needed about how this working relationship would function. Marcus would interpret any resistance to his authority as emotional reaction, rather than professional assessment, and he would dismiss concerns about his qualifications as personal resentment, rather than legitimate business considerations. You're right that we should take time to process everything, I agreed, standing to leave. I'll need to consider how I can best contribute to the company's success given the new organizational structure. After leaving the conference room, I returned to my office and immediately called David Rodriguez at Southwest Specialty Foods. If I was going to explore opportunities outside Chen Industries, I needed to understand the competitive landscape and the potential for senior leadership, positions with established companies. David answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the kind of energy that indicated he was between meetings but willing to make time for an interesting conversation. Sarah Chen, this is a pleasant surprise. How are things at Chen Industries? Eventful, I replied honestly. David, I'm wondering if you might have time for a conversation about the industry landscape and potential opportunities. Not necessarily immediate opportunities, but I'm evaluating my long-term career options. The pause that followed suggested David was processing the implications of my call, recognizing that senior executives don't typically evaluate long-term career options unless something significant has changed in their current situation. I'd be very interested in that conversation. Are you thinking about a phone discussion, or would you prefer to meet in person? In person would be better, if you can make time for it. How about tomorrow afternoon? I could meet you at the Phoenician Resort around 3 o'clock. The bar there is quiet enough for confidential discussions. The choice of location was thoughtful, sophisticated enough to match the importance of our conversation, but sufficiently removed from our respective offices to ensure privacy from industry colleagues who might draw conclusions from seeing us together. That works perfectly. I'll see you tomorrow at 3. After confirming the meeting, I spent the remainder of the afternoon reviewing financial reports and operational data that would help me understand Chen Industries' true market position relative to competitors like Southwest Specialty Foods. Information that would be valuable whether I joined David's company or used the intelligence to build something new. The numbers told a story that I found both encouraging and sobering. Chen Industries had achieved impressive growth and profitability under my operational leadership, but we were still significantly smaller than Southwest Specialty Foods in terms of revenue, geographic coverage, and market share. David's company generated nearly $300 million in annual revenue across 12 states, while we were celebrating our first $100 million year in 6 states. However, our profit margins were consistently higher, our client retention rates were superior, and our operational efficiency metrics outperformed industry benchmarks by substantial margins. We had built a more focused and effective business, even if it wasn't as large as our primary competitor. This analysis highlighted both the opportunity and the challenge of any decision to leave Chen Industries. Joining Southwest Specialty Foods would provide immediate access to greater resources and broader market reach, but it would also mean adapting to established systems and cultures that might not align with my management philosophy. Starting a new company would allow complete control over strategic direction and organizational culture, but it would require enormous capital investment and years of building operational infrastructure from scratch. Neither option was obviously superior, and both involved significant risks and uncertainties. That evening, I drove to Sedona for dinner with my Aunt Jennifer, Dad's sister who had always been the most independent-minded member of the Chen family. Jennifer had built a successful consulting practice specializing in family business transitions, work that had given her insight into the dynamics that often complicated succession planning in companies like ours. The drive through the desert gave me time to organize my thoughts and prepare for a conversation that I hoped would provide perspective on the family dynamics underlying Dad's decision. Jennifer had observed our business development over the years, but from sufficient distance to maintain objectivity about the personalities and relationships involved. Jennifer was waiting at the restaurant when I arrived, her silver hair catching the light from the setting sun, and her expression conveying the kind of calm wisdom that came from decades of helping families navigate complex transitions. At 65, she remained sharp, articulate, and completely unintimidated by difficult conversations about sensitive topics. "You look like someone who's had a challenging week," she observed, as we were seated at a table with panoramic views of the Red Rock, formations that made Sedona famous. "That's an understatement," I replied, grateful for her directness. Dad announced on Tuesday that Marcus is being promoted to CEO effective next month. Jennifer's expression shifted from casual interest to sharp attention, and I could see her processing the implications of this news with the analytical skills that had made her successful in family business consulting. "That's unexpected," she said carefully. "What rationale did your father provide for that decision?" I gave her a condensed version of Dad's explanation, including his references to Marcus's fresh perspective, innovative thinking, and potential for growth into the role. Jennifer listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly skeptical as I outlined the justifications that had been offered. "And how are you being positioned in this new structure?" she asked when I finished. "Senior Vice President of Operations reporting to Marcus. Basically continuing to handle the actual management of the company while he focuses on strategic planning and business development." Jennifer shook her head with the combination of professional expertise and family concern that made her opinion particularly valuable. "Sarah, that's one of the most dysfunctional succession plans I've encountered in 20 years of consulting. Your father is essentially asking you to do the CEO's job while giving someone else the CEO's title and authority." That's exactly how I see it. But I'm obviously not objective about the situation. I needed to hear from someone with experience in these kinds of transitions. "Trust me, your assessment is accurate. Effective succession planning involves gradually transferring responsibility to someone who has demonstrated increasing competence and leadership capability. What your father is proposing is the opposite, keeping responsibility with the proven performer while transferring authority to someone with no track record." Jennifer's validation of my concerns was both reassuring and depressing. Reassuring, because it confirmed that my reaction wasn't based on personal disappointment or wounded ego. Depressing because it suggested that Dad's decision was even more problematic than I had realized. "Why do you think he made this choice?" "Because the business justification makes no sense to me." Jennifer considered the question while sipping her wine, clearly choosing her words carefully to provide honest insight without unnecessarily damaging family relationships. "Your father is 61 years old. and he's spent 37 years building something he's enormously proud of. Like many men of his generation, he probably assumes that the natural continuation of that legacy involves passing it to his son, regardless of relative qualifications or interest levels. But I'm his child too, and I've demonstrated much greater interest and capability in the business. You are, but you're not the son who carries the Chen name forward to future generations. For traditional-minded men like your father, that distinction often outweighs practical considerations about competence and performance. The explanation aligned with what Mom had suggested during our phone conversation, but hearing it from Jennifer, who understood family business dynamics professionally, made it feel more definitive and less subject to interpretation. So this isn't really about Marcus's potential or my limitations. It's about gender assumptions that Dad might not even recognize he's making. Exactly. And the problem with unconscious bias is that people can't be reasoned out of positions they didn't reason themselves into. Your father probably genuinely believes that Marcus is the right choice, even though that belief is based on factors he would never acknowledge explicitly. What would you advise someone in my situation, assuming you were consulting for a family facing this kind of transition challenge? Jennifer smiled ruefully. Honestly, I would tell them that the succession plan is fundamentally flawed and likely to damage both the business and the family relationships. But I would also acknowledge that changing the decision-maker's mind is probably impossible once they've committed to this course of action. So, what are the realistic options for the person being displaced? Leave gracefully and build something better elsewhere. Don't waste energy fighting a battle you can't win, or trying to change minds that are closed to evidence. Use your capabilities and experience to create opportunities where they'll be properly valued and utilized. The advice was clear and practical, but it also represented the end of relationships and commitments that had defined my adult life. Leaving Chen Industries wouldn't just mean changing jobs. It would mean acknowledging that my family valued tradition over competence and gender over qualifications. Jennifer, if I left and started a competing company, would that be viewed as betrayal by the family? She considered this question for a long moment, understanding its complexity and its importance for my future relationship with relatives I cared about despite their disappointing decision-making. Some family members would probably see it that way initially, she said honestly. But your responsibility is to your own career and your own capabilities, not to protecting other people from the consequences of their poor judgment. If Chen Industries suffers because they chose inadequate leadership, that's their choice and their responsibility. And if I'm successful in building something that competes effectively with them, then you'll have proven that their assessment of your capabilities was wrong, and you'll have built something valuable that reflects your own vision and leadership abilities. Long term, that's probably the best outcome for everyone, including your family. The conversation continued through dinner and into the evening, with Jennifer helping me think through practical considerations that I would need to address, regardless of which direction I chose. Legal obligations related to non-compete agreements, ethical boundaries around client relationships and proprietary information, financial planning for career transition, and personal strategies for managing family tensions during a difficult period. By the time I drove back to Phoenix, I had a much clearer understanding of my situation and my options. Dad's decision wasn't going to change, and Marcus wasn't going to magically develop the experience and judgment required for effective leadership. I could either accept a diminished role that wasted my capabilities, or I could leave to build something that utilized them fully. The choice was becoming increasingly obvious, even if it remained emotionally difficult. I was going to leave Chen Industries, either to join David Rodriguez at Southwest Specialty Foods, or to start something entirely new. The only remaining question was which option would provide the best platform for demonstrating exactly what Marcus's leadership was worth compared to mine. Friday morning brought the formal announcement that Dad had promised, an email to all employees explaining the leadership transition and Marcus's appointment as CEO. The message emphasized continuity of operations, commitment to existing client relationships, and excitement about future growth opportunities under new leadership. Reading the announcement, with its corporate language and optimistic projections, I felt disconnected from the reality it described. This wasn't the beginning of an exciting new chapter. It was the end of an era that had been defined by competence-based leadership and strategic decision-making. My phone began ringing immediately after the announcement went out, with calls from department heads, key clients, and industry contacts who had questions about the transition and its implications for their relationships with Chen Industries. Each conversation required careful navigation between honesty and diplomacy, between personal feelings and professional responsibilities. The most difficult call came from Jennifer Morrison at Morrison Restaurant Group, our Portland client whose contract represented the largest expansion opportunity in our company's history. "Sarah, I just heard about the leadership change at Chen Industries. Marcus Chen is taking over as CEO? I have to admit, that's not what I was expecting." Jennifer's tone conveyed polite curiosity, but I could hear underlying concern about what this change might mean for the partnership we had been developing. She had worked exclusively with me during the negotiation process, and her confidence in the deal was based primarily on her assessment of my capabilities and commitment. "The transition is happening quickly," I acknowledged, "but I want to assure you that all existing commitments and partnerships will be honored completely." "Of course, but I'm wondering about the implementation details and ongoing account management. You've been our primary contact throughout this process, and frankly, your expertise and attention to detail are the main reasons we're confident about moving forward with Chen Industries." The conversation highlighted one of the most significant risks associated with Dad's succession plan. Client relationships in the food distribution industry were built on personal trust and demonstrated competence, not corporate brand loyalty. If key clients lost confidence in our leadership capabilities, contracts could be canceled and partnerships terminated regardless of formal agreements. "Jennifer, I'll continue to be involved in account management and implementation oversight. The organizational changes won't affect the level of service and attention that Morrison Restaurant Group receives." "That's reassuring, but I'd like to meet with Marcus before we finalize everything. Would it be possible to set up a call or meeting early next week?" The request was reasonable, but problematic. Marcus had never been involved in complex client negotiations, and his lack of industry knowledge would be obvious to someone with Jennifer's experience. But refusing the meeting would raise questions about his availability and commitment that could damage the relationship irreparably. "Absolutely. I'll coordinate with his schedule and get back to you with some options." After ending the call, I realized that the Portland contract had become a perfect test case for Marcus's leadership capabilities. If he could successfully navigate the meeting with Jennifer Morrison and maintain her confidence in our partnership, it would provide evidence that he could handle sophisticated client relationships. If he struggled or made mistakes that jeopardized the deal, it would demonstrate the real-world consequences of promoting someone without adequate experience. I scheduled the meeting for Tuesday afternoon, giving Marcus the weekend to prepare, and positioning myself to observe how he handled his first major client interaction as CEO designate. The outcome would influence my final decision about leaving Chen Industries and the timeline for exploring external opportunities. That afternoon, I drove to the Phoenician Resort for my meeting with David Rodriguez, carrying a portfolio of information about market analysis, competitive positioning, and strategic opportunities that I had compiled over the previous 2 days. Information that would demonstrate my value to Southwest Specialty Foods while helping me understand their organizational culture and growth plans. David was waiting in the bar when I arrived, his appearance striking the right balance between executive authority and casual approachability. At 48, he had built Southwest Specialty Foods from a regional distributor into a multi-state powerhouse through aggressive expansion and strategic acquisitions, growth that had established him as one of the most respected leaders in our industry. "Sarah, thank you for making time for this conversation. I have to admit, I'm curious about what's prompting your interest in exploring career options. I gave him a carefully edited version of recent developments at Chen Industries, focusing on strategic differences rather than personal disappointments and emphasizing my interest in opportunities for greater leadership responsibility. So you're looking for a senior role that would utilize your operational expertise and strategic capabilities more fully than your current position allows? Exactly. I've reached a point in my career where I'm ready for challenges that match my experience and capabilities, and I'm interested in understanding what kinds of opportunities might exist with companies like Southwest Specialty Foods. David leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of analytical attention that had made him successful in evaluating acquisition targets and strategic partnerships. Sarah, I've been watching Chen Industries' performance for several years, and I've been impressed with the operational improvements and market expansion you've achieved. Your profit margins are consistently higher than ours. Your client retention rates are superior, and your growth trajectory has been remarkable. The compliments were gratifying, but they also highlighted the magnitude of what I would be walking away from if I left Chen Industries. Everything David was praising represented work that I had done, systems that I had built, and relationships that I had cultivated over 12 years of dedicated effort. What kind of role would you envision for someone with my background and experience? I'd be interested in discussing a senior vice president position overseeing our expansion into new markets, specifically focusing on the southwestern region where Chen Industries has been most successful. Your knowledge of that market and your relationships with suppliers and clients would be extremely valuable for our growth strategy. The opportunity was appealing in many ways. Southwest Specialty Foods had the resources and market presence to implement strategies that would take years to develop at a smaller company. And David's leadership style seemed collaborative and results-oriented rather than hierarchical and political. However, the role he was describing would essentially involve competing directly against Chen Industries using knowledge and relationships that I had developed while working there. The ethical implications were complex, even if the legal restrictions were minimal due to the absence of meaningful non-compete agreements in my employment contract. David, I appreciate your interest, and the opportunity sounds intriguing. But I need to be careful about any potential conflicts of interest or ethical boundaries related to my current position. Of course, we would work with legal counsel to ensure that any transition was handled appropriately and that all confidentiality and non-compete obligations were respected completely. We spent the next hour discussing Southwest Specialty Foods' organizational structure, growth plans, and management philosophy. David's approach to leadership emphasized performance-based advancement, collaborative decision-making, and strategic risk-taking that balanced aggressive growth with operational stability. The conversation confirmed that joining his company would provide immediate access to resources and opportunities that would take years to develop independently. But it also revealed that I would be one senior executive among several, with influence over specific market segments rather than comprehensive strategic direction. Sarah, I'd like to continue this conversation and potentially arrange for you to meet with other members of our executive team. Would you be interested in exploring this opportunity further? I would, with the understanding that I need to resolve my current situation appropriately before making any commitments. The timing of any transition would need to be coordinated carefully to ensure minimal disruption for all parties involved. Absolutely. Take whatever time you need to handle your current responsibilities properly. This is the kind of opportunity that's worth doing right, rather than rushing into prematurely. Driving back to Phoenix, I reflected on how dramatically my perspective had shifted over the course of a single week. 7 days ago, I had been focused on implementation strategies for expanding Chen Industries into new markets and optimizing operations for continued growth. Now I was evaluating opportunities to compete against the company I had helped build, using capabilities and relationships that had been developed during 12 years of dedicated service. The transformation felt both necessary and tragic. Necessary, Because staying at Chen Industries would mean accepting limitations and compromises that would waste my professional capabilities. Tragic, because leaving would end relationships and commitments that had been central to my adult identity. But as I considered the alternatives, one thing became increasingly clear. I was not going to spend the next decade of my career in a subordinate role, supporting someone else's vision while my own capabilities remained underutilized. Whether that meant joining David Rodriguez, starting an independent company, or finding some other path forward, I was done accepting constraints imposed by other people's assumptions about what I could or should achieve. The real question was no longer whether I would leave Chen Industries, but how I would leverage my departure to build something better than what I was losing. Something that would prove, once and for all, exactly what Marcus's leadership was worth compared to mine. Monday morning would bring new conversations, new decisions, and new opportunities to demonstrate the value that Dad had chosen to overlook. And for the first time since his devastating announcement, I was looking forward to showing him exactly what kind of mistake he had made. 18 months later, I stood in the executive conference room of Rodriguez Chen Specialty Distribution, looking out at the Phoenix skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a perfect view of the Chen Industries building 6 blocks away. The irony wasn't lost on me that I could literally see the empire I had helped build from the headquarters of the company that was systematically dismantling it. The quarterly board meeting had just concluded with news that exceeded even my most optimistic projections. Rodriguez Chen had captured 43% of the southwestern specialty food distribution market, recruited 67 former Chen Industries employees, and secured partnerships with 85% of the premium restaurants that had previously been exclusive Chen Industries clients. David Rodriguez joined me at the window, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who had just witnessed the validation of a calculated risk that many industry experts had initially questioned. "Your brother called my office again. This morning," he said with barely concealed amusement. "Third time this month. His assistant says he wants to discuss potential partnership opportunities, but we both know he's looking for a way to stop the bleeding." The bleeding was severe and accelerating. Marcus had managed to destroy in 18 months what had taken Dad 37 years to build. Client defections, operational failures, employee resignations, and financial losses had reduced Chen Industries from a market leader to a struggling regional distributor that survived primarily on long-term contracts that hadn't expired yet. "What did you tell his assistant?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Same thing I've told her the previous 2 times. Rodriguez Chen doesn't partner with companies that compete in our core markets. We acquire them when the price is right." The acquisition discussions had been ongoing for 3 months, ever since Chen Industries' financial position had deteriorated to the point where Dad could no longer maintain operations without external capital injection. Marcus had initially approached Southwest Specialty Foods directly, but David had redirected all negotiations through Rodriguez Chen, recognizing the poetic justice in having me evaluate the terms for purchasing the company I had originally built. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca, now my chief operating officer, confirming that the final due diligence reports were ready for my review. The numbers told a story of spectacular mismanagement that had transformed a profitable $100 million enterprise into a distressed asset worth perhaps $30 million in a fire sale. Marcus had implemented every trendy business concept he could find online, from blockchain inventory tracking that never worked properly to social media marketing campaigns that alienated long-standing business clients. He had hired expensive consultants to solve problems that didn't exist while ignoring operational fundamentals that required daily attention and expertise. The Portland contract had been the first major failure, terminated after Jennifer Morrison's initial meeting with Marcus convinced her that Chen Industries lacked the leadership competence to handle complex logistics requirements. Within 6 months, Morrison Restaurant Group had signed an exclusive distribution agreement with Rodriguez Chen, bringing their 43 locations and $15 million in annual volume to our growing client portfolio. The employee exodus had been equally dramatic. Alexander Chen, our former head of logistics, had joined Rodriguez Chen as senior vice president of operations after watching Marcus ignore his recommendations about capacity planning and inventory management. Patricia Simmons from Human Resources had followed, along with 12 of our top sales representatives and most of the warehouse supervisors who had built their careers around systems I had originally developed. Each departure had weakened Chen Industries' operational capacity while strengthening ours, creating a competitive advantage that compounded over time. We weren't just capturing market share. We were absorbing the institutional knowledge and client relationships that had made Chen Industries successful in the first place. Dad had tried to intervene after the first year of losses, resuming daily operational involvement and attempting to implement damage control strategies. But the problems had already become systematic and cultural, requiring comprehensive restructuring that Marcus resisted and that remaining employees had lost confidence in. The breaking point had come 6 months ago when Chen Industries defaulted on their primary credit facility, forcing Dad to choose between personal bankruptcy and selling the company to avoid complete financial ruin. The same facility that I had helped negotiate 4 years earlier, when our growth trajectory and operational efficiency had qualified us for the most favorable lending terms available in our industry. Now Marcus was calling David's office with increasing desperation, hoping to negotiate some kind of partnership or merger that would preserve his position while accessing the capital and expertise necessary to prevent complete collapse. What he didn't understand was that Rodriguez Chen had no interest in preserving anything about Chen Industries, except its client contracts and remaining assets. Rebecca appeared in the conference room doorway with the due diligence files and an expression that indicated she had news beyond the financial reports. "The Chen Industries board meeting ended an hour ago," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Marcus and your father are requesting a meeting to discuss acquisition terms. They want to meet here tomorrow afternoon." The request represented the final acknowledgement that Dad's succession plan had failed completely. After 18 months of defending Marcus's leadership and dismissing criticism as family disloyalty, he was now seeking rescue from the daughter he had passed over and the company she had built in response to his rejection. "What terms are they proposing?" I asked, though the answer mattered less than the symbolism of having them come to our offices to negotiate surrender. "They're not proposing terms. They're asking us to make an offer for the assets, contracts, and remaining operations. Essentially, they want us to tell them what we're willing to pay for what's left of Chen Industries." The reversal was so complete that it felt almost anticlimactic. I had spent months imagining this moment, the vindication of watching Dad recognize that his decision to promote Marcus had been catastrophically wrong. But now that it was happening, I felt more sadness than satisfaction, more regret about what had been lost than triumph about what had been proven. "Schedule the meeting for 3 o'clock tomorrow. Conference room B so they can see the operations floor and understand exactly what we've built here." Conference room B offered a view of our main distribution facility, where former Chen Industries employees were managing inventory systems I had designed and implementing efficiency protocols I had developed. Dad would be able to see everything he had lost when he chose tradition over competence, legacy over performance. That evening, I drove to the restaurant where I had dinner with Jennifer 18 months ago, needing time to process the complexity of emotions that tomorrow's meeting would bring. The desert sunset painted the mountains in brilliant oranges and purples, the same beauty that had provided comfort during the darkest period of my professional life. My phone rang with a call from Mom, the first direct contact we had had in several months. Our relationship had been strained since my departure from Chen Industries, with family gatherings becoming awkward negotiations around topics that might trigger arguments about business decisions and their consequences. "Sarah, your father told me about tomorrow's meeting. He's hoping you'll be willing to find a solution that preserves something of what he built." The plea was predictable, but painful. Mom had watched Dad's business dreams crumble under Marcus's Leadership had seen their retirement security evaporate along with the company's value, and was now hoping that family loyalty would motivate me to offer terms that went beyond cold business calculation. Mom, I'm willing to pay fair market value for the assets and contracts. That's more generous than most acquirers would offer, for a distressed company with Chen Industries' current financial position. But what about Marcus? What about preserving some role for him in whatever comes next? The question revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had created this situation in the first place. The assumption that family relationships should override business competence, that Marcus deserved opportunities regardless of his demonstrated failures. Marcus will receive whatever severance package is included in his employment contract, the same as any other terminated executive. Beyond that, his future employment is his responsibility, not mine. Sarah, he's your brother. Surely there's some way to help him transition into a role where he can contribute meaningfully. Mom, Marcus had 18 months to demonstrate his leadership capabilities while running a $100 million company. The results speak for themselves. I'm not responsible for managing the consequences of Dad's decision to promote someone who wasn't qualified for the position. The conversation continued with Mom making increasingly desperate appeals for family solidarity, while I maintained that business decisions should be based on business considerations rather than emotional relationships. We ended the call without resolution, both understanding that tomorrow's meeting would probably determine our family dynamics for years to come. The next afternoon, Dad and Marcus arrived at Rodriguez Chen headquarters exactly on time, both wearing suits that attempted to project confidence despite the circumstances that had brought them here. Dad's expression was carefully neutral, revealing nothing about what this meeting meant to him personally or professionally. Marcus looked nervous, fidgeting with documents and avoiding eye contact as Rebecca escorted them to conference room B. I had arranged the seating so that Dad and Marcus would face the windows overlooking our operations floor, ensuring they could see the bustling activity of employees who had chosen to follow my leadership rather than remain loyal to theirs. The symbolism was intentional and unmistakable. Sarah, Dad began as we settled around the conference table, I want to thank you for making time for this discussion. I know the circumstances are complicated, but I'm hoping we can find a mutually beneficial solution. The formal politeness was surreal, considering we were negotiating the purchase of assets from the company I had spent 12 years building and 18 months competing against. But it also reflected Dad's recognition that I now held all the leverage in a situation that he had created through his own decision-making. I've reviewed the financial statements and operational reports that your legal team provided, I replied, opening the folder containing my analysis of Chen Industries' current value. The numbers tell a clear story about the challenges the company has faced over the past 18 months. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly aware that those challenges reflected directly on his leadership performance. Dad maintained his composed expression, but I could see the tension around his eyes as he prepared to hear my assessment of what remained of his life's work. Based on current market conditions, outstanding debt obligations, and projected cash flow requirements, Rodriguez Chen is prepared to offer $28 million for Chen Industries assets, client contracts, and remaining inventory. The offer was fair but devastating, representing less than 30% of what the company had been worth when Marcus assumed leadership. Dad's composed expression cracked slightly as he processed the magnitude of value destruction that had occurred under his chosen successor. That seems significantly below the company's intrinsic value, Marcus said, speaking for the first time since entering the conference room. Our client relationships and market position should command a premium above pure asset valuation. The objection revealed his continued disconnection from business reality. Client relationships had value only when they were stable and profitable, and market position meant nothing without the operational capability to serve customers effectively. Marcus, Most of Chen Industries' valuable client relationships have already transferred to Rodriguez Chen or other competitors. The market position you're referencing no longer exists in any meaningful sense. I slid a detailed breakdown across the table, showing client defections, revenue declines, and market share losses that had occurred month by month since his promotion. The data was comprehensive and irrefutable, a timeline of systematic business destruction that correlated perfectly with his leadership tenure. Dad studied the documents with the analytical skills that had once made him successful, his expression growing increasingly grim as he absorbed the full scope of what had been lost. When he finished reviewing the analysis, he looked directly at me for the first time since entering the room. "Sarah, these numbers are accurate. The decline has been worse than I realized." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I made a mistake in succession planning. I chose emotion over evaluation, and the results have been catastrophic for everything I spent my life building." The admission was more complete than I had expected, and more painful. Dad was acknowledging not just business failure, but personal failure in judgment that had destroyed his legacy and damaged his family relationships beyond repair. The $28 million offer includes assumption of current debt obligations and retention of existing employment contracts for non-management staff, I continued, maintaining professional focus despite the emotional weight of his acknowledgement. Rodriguez Chen would honor all client commitments and maintain operations at current facilities for at least 12 months. "What about management transition and consulting arrangements?" Dad asked. "Would there be opportunities for Marcus and me to contribute to the integration process?" The question represented a final attempt to preserve some dignity and influence in a situation where they had lost all leverage. But it also reflected continued misunderstanding about the nature of this transaction and their role in what would follow. "Dad, this isn't a merger or partnership. It's an acquisition of distressed assets. Rodriguez Chen doesn't need consulting assistance from former Chen Industries management. We've been successfully serving your former clients for over a year." Marcus finally seemed to grasp the finality of what was happening. "So that's it? Everything Dad built just gets absorbed into your company and disappears?" "Everything Dad built was systematically destroyed over the past 18 months. What's being preserved is whatever value can be recovered from what remains." The meeting concluded with Dad accepting the offer, recognizing that alternatives were either bankruptcy or complete liquidation that would recover even less value. Marcus signed the documents with obvious reluctance, finally understanding that his 18 months as CEO had effectively ended his business career. As they prepared to leave, Dad turned back from the conference room door with one final observation. "Sarah, you were right about everything. The succession planning, the leadership requirements, the consequences of promoting someone who wasn't qualified. I let personal feelings override business judgment, and everyone paid the price for that mistake." The acknowledgement provided closure, but not satisfaction. Proving that I had been right all along felt less important than it had 18 months ago, when my primary motivation had been professional vindication rather than business success. 6 months later, the integration was complete. Chen Industries had officially ceased to exist, its assets absorbed into Rodriguez Chen, and its name retired from the industry it had once helped define. Dad had used his portion of the sale proceeds to purchase a small retirement home in Flagstaff, finally accepting that his business career was over. Marcus had moved to Portland, where he was reportedly working as a marketing coordinator for a technology startup, pursuing the kind of entry-level position he should have accepted years earlier, instead of attempting to run a complex distribution company. I remained as president and COO of Rodriguez Chen, having built a business that generated over $200 million in annual revenue across 8 states. The company I had created in response to rejection had become larger and more successful than the one I had originally been denied the chance to lead. But the victory felt incomplete in ways I hadn't anticipated. Building something new had been more satisfying than destroying something old, and proving my capabilities had been more important than proving other people's mistakes. The family relationships that had been damaged probably couldn't be fully repaired, but the professional goals that had driven my decisions had been achieved completely. Standing again at the conference room windows, watching the sunset paint the desert mountains in brilliant colors, I reflected on how dramatically everything had changed since that devastating Tuesday when Dad announced Marcus's promotion. The woman who had been deemed unworthy of inheriting the family business had built something better than what she had been denied. Sometimes the most devastating rejections create opportunities for the greatest achievements. And sometimes proving that someone made a mistake in underestimating you is less important than proving to yourself exactly what you're capable of achieving when limitations are removed and possibilities are unlimited. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.